All right, good evening. We appreciate you all waiting for us. We are about to get going here. First of all, thank you. We appreciate the time that you're going to spend with us this evening. My name is Brad Kay. I'm the city manager for the City of Midland. What we're going to do is talk a little bit from our Advisory Committee on Infrastructure, which is a subcommittee of the Midland Business Alliance and a partner with the City of Midland. This is a group that has been working together for a long period of time, it seems, and is culminating, at least in tonight's public presentation, on some of the projects, some of the different objectives, some of the initiatives that have been brought forward as possible solutions or partial solutions to the flooding challenges and the legacy flooding issues that we have in the City of Midland. Let me just, again, on behalf of the city, on behalf of the Midland Business Alliance, and on behalf of the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure, welcome you all tonight. And once again, we appreciate your time. As I mentioned, this is a partnership. You'll hear about that tonight in terms of how we've all worked together and will continue to work together, not only through today, but into the future as well. Before we get going, though, there are a few housekeeping matters that I would like to address just so that everybody understands clearly how the meeting will proceed and how this online meeting is going to take place tonight. First of all, other than the speakers, everyone is muted and will continue to be muted throughout the presentation. That includes the panelists as well as all public participants in the meeting as well. We will be taking questions. However, what we're going to ask you to do is enter those into the chat box. When you do so, it gives us an opportunity to make sure that we cover them. We have the proper person address them as we go forward. You may see a response in the chat box that says it's already been addressed or will be addressed online. That is simply a notation that as we go through our own questions and look at it from our backside, we can tell where that is. Excuse me, I said chat box, but I should have said the Q&A box. So make sure you put it into the Q&A box and we will get to your questions in that. But in any event, as I said, you may see a notation that it's been addressed online. We will get to it if that notation does come up. So don't take fear with that. We move forward. Another thing I should mention as well is that this will be a recorded session this evening. So we will be taking it. You may see at times, I'm not quite sure if the text box are going to come up across the bottom in your view, but if you do, that's part of the recording process. Our goal is to record this, make it available, and push it out both through the City of Midland's website, but also the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure's website so that people can view it again if you want to look at it again tonight, or you can refer other people to look at that as well. So let me start by introducing our panelists. As I mentioned, this is a partnership between the City of Midland, the Midland Business Alliance, and the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure. Again, my name is Brad Kay. I'm the city manager representing the City of Midland this evening. Representing the Midland Business Alliance is Tony Thomas, the MBA president and CEO, who is present, and you'll see his face on the slides this evening. And then importantly, the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure, which is sort of the working group of the MBA. This committee has been co-chaired by J.W. Fisher and Leanne Keller, both of whom are with us this evening, by our community volunteer extraordinaire, Mr. Bill Schutte, who has been a driving force behind a lot of the work that we have been putting on and putting forward and continue to push forward as we go. And the session, particularly the Q&As at the end of our evening, will be moderated by Bruce Clark, who again is working with the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure. And then finally, you'll get to know Nick Czerwinski, who is a principal with the Spicer Group, which is an engineering firm that has been doing a lot of the research, a lot of the analysis. And you're going to hear from Nick a little bit extensively tonight in terms of the project list that he's developed along with others and how that list was developed, the process that they're going through, and sort of where they are, at least in that evaluation process. So a number of names, a number of faces will come in front of you. That will take a little bit of time before we do that. And then when we're done the presentation side, again, that's where we will get into the Q&A and the questions that you ask. So again, in the Q&A box, if you can please enter those at any point in time, we will continue to monitor those throughout the night. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our co-chair, Leanne Keller, and Leanne's going to take over for the next little bit of the presentation. Leanne.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I look forward to talking with all of you tonight, and as well as sharing the screen with my fellow teammates as well. And what I want to do is kind of give you a little bit of an overview just to get us started about the Midland Business Alliance and how we got involved in this Advisory Committee on Infrastructure. And just from a historical perspective, this team was actually formed in 2021, and the Advisory Committee on Infrastructure was started by the Midland Business Alliance Board of Directors. And our first call to order was to step back and look at any type of infrastructure issue that affected both quality of life and economic vitality. And as all of you can imagine, that includes quite a lot of things. And so we decided we needed to sort of focus in on what we thought some of the biggest issues were. And the first issue that we decided as a committee to work on was flooding in the region. One of the reasons that we looked at that is because we had a history of flooding, of course. And if you look at just most recently, even as you go back in time, for those of you, not to date myself, but I'm going back to 1986 when I moved here to Midland, we have had, in that time that I've been here, 5 floods that would be considered in the major flood stage, which is about 28 feet. But we've had many more that have reached the flood stage of 24 feet. So we realized that this wasn't just the last flood that we all can have lived through and that we all saw, which we think of as the flood when the dams failed. But it's really been something that's been going on for quite a few years. And so we knew that was important. So slide change, please. So our first mandate, as we narrowed down into flooding, was to really look at kind of this long-standing flood issue that we just talked about, and looking at how it impacts us as businesses in the community, our citizens, our folks that are residents here, of course, and overall economic development. And we kind of focused in on 2 different things. We focused in on what we would call our legacy flooding challenges. And for us, that was, reducing both the frequency and the severity of flooding. But we also knew that there was work going on with the city and other, and the county and other organizations looking at sanitary, sewer, and stormwater issues. But there was a third thing we decided to focus in on, and that was resiliency too. And I find that to be a pretty important one, because we don't often think about resiliency and kind of that proactive way of looking at flooding. We can't get rid of water, we can't stop it, but we can reduce the impact of it. And that's what our main focus is, and we're going to be talking about a little bit more. But resiliency is looking at things like building codes and how and where we put infrastructure into our own homes. For instance, if we put our furnaces and things like that in the basement, and the first place that floods is the basement, we could be doing design changes to move those to other places. And there's lots of different things that other communities have done looking at resiliency efforts, like having parks that can be served as retention ponds and things like that when there are not flooding issues, and then they can be used as retention when it does flood. So those are just some different options and ideas around what resiliency can be. But we have actually formed our committee to start looking at those. When we first started, we saw emerging what I would call 2 lanes, and that's what I'm going to end on right here. And those 2 lanes include what I would call longer term, bigger projects, and those are projects that you'll hear JW talk about in a minute, that are more focused on projects that the Army Corps of Engineers are helping us with, and looking at things that they could be structural, they could be environmental, they could be using land for retention ponds, things like that. But they're much longer and probably are going to take in excess of 10, 20, 30 years to complete. As we talked about it on our committee, if we had started looking at some of those things back in 1986, we might not be looking at them now, right? Because we would have addressed those. And then the second area, our second lane, is looking at what we would call short to midterm projects, which you'll get a flavor for today. And these are things that we have funding for, that we want to start looking at implementing in the next 1 to 5 years that would help us impact our flooding. So that's just kind of a quick overview. I'm going to turn it over to JW so he can talk a little bit about the engineering aspect and where we're going in both of our lanes of work. So thank you. Off to you, JW.
Thank you, Leanne. Like Leanne says, we've been working on this really since February of 2021. And one of the first things we did, we went out and raised some private funds, almost $1.3 million of private funding to get us started and to give us some seed money. And the very first thing we did is we hired ACOI, which is an international engineering firm, just to make sure that we weren't going to be tilting at windmills for 3 years, and that there were practical, substantial, impactful things that we could do to help our flooding issues. And they came back very positively and said that, yes, we're not the only town that's sited on a river, and other towns have summoned the political will and the wherewithal to do something about it. So with that vote of confidence, we hired the U.S. Army, or we entered into a contract with Midland County, the NBA, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And the Corps of Engineers has been very engaged with Midland. They've been up several times. They've surveyed the areas that flood. They have a good understanding of our river system. And the first thing they are doing, and they are almost complete, is doing a hydraulics and hydrology study of the Tibbawasee Rivershed. It's a big watershed. It covers 2,600 square miles. The Corps of Engineers tells us that this is the largest H&H study that they've done out of the Detroit district. So it gives you an idea of the scope of the study. The cost of that study is $860,000, and we have a 50% local cost share. And we've used some of that money that we raised privately to fund that. And again, that's a partnership between the County of Midland, the NBA, and the Corps of Engineers. So next slide, please. As I said, they're almost done with their hydrology and hydraulics study. The hydrology information is, and we are anxiously awaiting for the hydraulics information. But we have already gone through 2 congressional budget cycles to get a second study called a general investigation study approved. And to give you an idea how hard this is, we were one of only 5 that was approved in the country for this year's budget cycle. And it takes 2 budget cycles to get this done. It has to be appropriated 1 year, and then the next year the money has to be authorized 1 year, and the next year the money has to be appropriated. So we have a draft contract, and that contract will be between the County of Midland, the City of Midland, the Corps, and the NBA. Again, we have a 50% local cost share for that, and so it's estimated to be a $3 million study that will take 3 years, and our local cost share then would be $1.5 million. We have the money in place via a state grant to the City of Midland. So we're in good shape to get the Corps off and running on that. And this is the study where the Corps will actually take the data from the first study and look for solutions to our legacy flooding problem. So the goal is to reduce the frequency and severity of flooding in Midland County and the City of Midland. And for the really big long-term work, you really need the Corps of Engineers to do that. Unfortunately, the Corps of Engineers does not move at a rapid pace. They have their methodology, and they follow it. And any project that would result from the Corps of Engineers work would not start until 2030. That seems like a long time, but it's 2024 already. And really part of that lengthy time frame is that, again, once the Corps selects projects they want to build, it takes 2 budget cycles in Congress to get it approved and ready to go. So next slide, please. I talked about the longer term, the GI study, and that is where the Corps will develop solutions and look at actual projects. I just got a little bit ahead of myself, which is my want, I guess. Again, it needs a congressional authorization to move forward, which we have secured. And the types of projects would be flood walls, pump stations, levees, and really large-scale detention basins and retention basins. And a lot of these would be really serve a dual purpose. They would serve as flood control, and they would serve as environmental and aid to the environment, mostly by keeping sediment and siltation out of the river system, out of the creek system, and probably producing wetlands that act as filters. So next slide, please. So those are the type of thing the Corps of Engineers working on. And again, any of those projects would have a likely start date in 2030. But we've also been working with state legislators, and through the good work of our partners and our legislators, both the Senate and the House, bipartisan effort, we secured $40 million for the City of Midland's flood reduction and resiliency infrastructure projects. And that 40 million was appropriated in two tranches. 25 million came through the American Rescue Plan Act, often referred to as ARPA, and is administered by EGLE, the Michigan State Department of Environmental Quality. And 15 million is a state enhancement grant administered by the MEDC. So the 25 million that comes through the federal government and flows through the state has a very tight timeline. The city has to let EGLE know by the end of this year in good detail how they're going to spend that. And any project that's being spent on that 25 million has to be complete by December 31st of 2026. So it puts a timeline constraint on any projects that might be chosen. The 15 million state enhancement grant has a little more lenient timeline. That work, any project funded by that grant would need to be completed by the end of 2028. I've already noted that the city has gotten state money to pay for the local cost share of the second core study, and that 1.5 million for that has come from the MEDC grant. So next slide, please. So we formed a partnership with Spicer Engineering to meet a tight deadline. We got a running start. The Spicer Group is working with city engineers, staff, and our committee to select potential projects, use the data from the Corps' hydrology model, and then evaluate those projects as to a list of criteria that Nick will talk about, Nick from Spicer, next. And try to help City Council. City Council will really have to choose which projects they're going to build, at least with the 25 million through the EGLE grant in October. So we've been working hard to help them do that. We've got community input scheduled. We're talking to all the service groups. We're here speaking with you tonight. We're going to have an open house. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bree, but I think it's August 9th in City Council chambers. And again, council will have to decide on which projects are the best use of this money in October. Again, these could be excuse me here, I gotta make sure I'm not stealing Nick's thunder. So Nick, I'm going to turn this over to Nick from Spicer for Spicer Engineering, because this is where his presentation starts.
Good evening. Thank you, JW. So as JW mentioned, we are working with the MBA, the city and the county to go through and identify projects that could be helpful and be implemented in a shorter time frame so that the 25 million and 15 million could be spent on time in accordance with those obligations. So when we step back and we start looking at the flood reduction projects that could potentially take place in Midland, we were looking at two different types of problems. So there's local flooding, which is we have a rainfall event. The rainfall lands in a neighborhood. It overwhelms the local drainage system, such as the storm sewer in your front street or the ditch near your house. And then that causes flooding issues. And then there's the river flooding, which is when the river becomes elevated at a higher stage due to large amounts of rainwater, and the river pushes water out of the banks and floods out neighborhoods. So there's two different types of flooding problems that we're looking to address here. And these four different types of projects that I have on the screens are tools for looking at reducing those flooding issues. So the first one is improvements to existing storm sewer drainage systems. So examples of this would be city storm sewers or county drain storm sewers. So a project to address a existing storm sewer that's underperforming. And this would be a good solution for your local flooding problem. Another type of improvement would be improvements to open channel drainage systems. So these are your ditches, the ditches along your road or through your backyard. And examples of this would be county drain ditches or natural water courses, such as the creeks that traverse the city, like the Snake Creek and Sturgeon Creek. A third type of project would be a stormwater storage centric project. So looking at storing stormwater in an area that we want it to be stored and then slowly release it downstream. And this aids the existing infrastructure in keeping up with the rain water and the stormwater as it flows downstream. Examples of this would be floodplain enhancements. So working to optimize the amount of water that's currently stored in our existing floodplains. Another type of stormwater storage project would be a regional detention basin. So creating a stormwater pond to temporarily store water during a rain event and again release it slowly downstream. And these stormwater storage projects are beneficial because they can aid in both the local drainage problems and flooding problems and potentially contribute to a more effective solution on the river flooding problem. So when we're talking about river flooding, we're really looking at more of a flood protection system as opposed to a drainage system. Examples of this would be flood walls, levees, pump stations. So I'm going to use the Snake and Sturgeon Creek as an example because those were both identified as large flood sources for this river flooding. So when the river comes up and the stage becomes elevated, a lot of the water pushes backwards through the bridges at Main Street on the Snake and the Sturgeon and inundates the floodplains of the Snake and the Sturgeon and the local properties with river water because there's nothing there stopping it from pushing its way upstream. An example of a flood protection system that we looked at would be walls, levees, floodgates that would be positioned on the existing bridges to close and stop the river water from pushing through the bridge upstream into the neighborhoods. And so that would help keep the river water contained in the river rather than allowing it to flow freely upstream, up the connected water courses and flood out those adjacent neighborhoods. So when we implement a system like this to stop the flow of river water upstream, we have to kind of pair that with a pump station, which would continue to maintain the flow of water in the creeks downstream. So the floodgate closes, the wall is being activated, the river water can no longer push upstream during high river stages, and then the pump station activates to continue to move the water that's coming down the creeks towards the river. The pumps kick in and move that into the river so that people aren't being flooded from the local water not being able to get through. Next slide, please. So with those 4 tools in our toolbox, we aim to develop a team and a list of projects that would be the basis of our study. So our team is composed of City of Midland staff, the Midland County Drain Commissioner, MBA members that are on the infrastructure committee, and then the Spicer Group team members. Our team met multiple times over the course of several months to get all of our thoughts into one room and develop a list of projects. And we were very free thinking and everything that we could think of that would help reduce the flood efforts. The way that we kind of focused our ideas was looking at these 3 key areas. So we looked at areas of repeat flooding. So areas of town that there's been multiple flooding occurrences that is a persistent problem. Obviously, we want to look at projects in those neighborhoods to help prevent that from continuing to occur. There was a handful of previous studies that were done in this area as mentioned earlier, this is a legacy problem. People have been looking at it for a while. So we looked at those previous studies and scoured them to see if there were previous projects that were identified but not implemented. Third, we looked at areas of land that may be available to construct stormwater storage. As I mentioned previously, these stormwater storage projects can aid in both local and river flooding scenarios. And so having those identified is a very important part of our project. And we have to focus in an urbanized area where the land is open, where it's undeveloped, to be able to store stormwater. It always becomes a challenge in a well-developed area that has flooding issues of where to store the water, because there is so many existing houses, businesses, and infrastructure already in the area. Next slide, please. So leading up to the slides here where I'm going to show some maps and potential project lists, I just wanted to give everybody an idea of all the data sources that we use to generate the project list. So as I mentioned, we had our committee and we took input from all the members of the committee, which included the City of Midland, Midland County Drain Commissioner, MBA member input, and Spicer input. And we also looked at existing documents that identified projects that could be beneficial. So one of those documents was the City of Midland Stormwater Capital Improvement Plan. We also looked at a study that was conducted in 2018 by the City of Midland that looked extensively at the city's storm sewer network. And then in 1980, there was a study that was completed by the Army Corps of Engineers that looked at a more regional approach dealing with flooding caused by the river. So we also considered that. And then there was a couple different documents through past studies or current feedback where public comments were captured, and we looked at those and implemented those into our project list as well. The projects that are being presented tonight are actively being evaluated and removed from the project list as they deem themselves not viable. So we have a detailed process for vetting the projects. We took our complete project list that was developed, and then we started looking at them and identifying, are these practical? Are these something the community would view as acceptable? Is this something that's cost effective? Is this something that performs well? Is this something that, you know, we could have the land available for? So as we went through that process, a few projects fell off the list right away. And then we identified the projects that were still in the running, still viable projects, and we started our engineering process. And so if you could move to the next slide, please, Bree. We have a map here. And so this is a map kind of highlighting the different areas of town and showing where the projects that kind of made it past that first hurdle are located and what kind of category they fall into out of those first four categories that I mentioned for stormwater projects. So everything that made it to this concept planning phase is shown on the map, and you'll see a legend over on the right-hand side of the screen. So everywhere you see a red X or plus sign, that is a potential culvert that was considered for replacement. The yellow highlights on the map are areas where we were looking at placing potential flood control structures. These would be used to control the flow of water and store water. The next symbol is the purple squares. So you'll see some of those along Main Street near the river, a few of them along Saginaw Road, and then one up on Sugnet on the Snake Creek. These are stormwater pump stations that were being considered and evaluated. There's several open channel water courses that were being evaluated for improvements, such as the state drain over in the right-hand side of the screen, and the Sturgeon Creek between Saginaw Road and US 10. And then there's also some dark pink highlights that you see sprinkled throughout some of the city streets. So these are storm sewer replacements. So these are projects that were identified through either public comment or through the 2018 extensive look at the city storm sewer network that were identified as potentially benefiting from an improvement project. And then the last item that you see on the map are these orange areas. So these orange areas are areas that we looked at perhaps doing a project to improve the amount of stormwater that could be stored. So like I said, this is everything that made it through the concept planning phase. And as we flip to the next slide, you'll see a similar map with some of the projects removed. So these are the projects that are still in the running today. As mentioned previously, there's 27 projects that are still actively being evaluated. And so the projects that were eliminated, again, were eliminated from feedback from the different engineering teams looking at this from multiple different reasons. Some of the projects may have fit better with that Army Corps study that's coming up. So we took those out of our study and decided to shelf those temporarily and provide them to the Army Corps. Some of them didn't prove to be beneficial after we got the model ran and observed the effects. We've been coordinating closely with EGLE, the Michigan Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, to identify projects that may present issues for permitting. And so some got removed because of that. And then others got removed just because it didn't really fit our project goals. So as we move forward onto the next slide, you'll see that I have the parts of the city broken up into 3 panels. So this is the west panel. So you can see we'll start on the state drain. We're looking at a project on the state drain, which is an open channel improvement project, which would include sediment and debris removal along the state drain between Saginaw and the extreme northern limit of the drain. You'll notice that there's a couple crossings that are being highlighted with red X's for replacement. Those are crossings that were identified as being too hydraulically restrictive or undersized. They couldn't adequately convey the stormwater. And then we would have all of our typical cleanup and restoration and other activities that would take place as part of the project if this is selected after project completion. You'll notice on Saginaw Street, there's 2 stormwater pump stations indicated with the purple boxes. So these would be stormwater pump stations, one located on the state drain and one located on the Sturgeon Creek, that would be used to convey water when that river is at a high stage. These would be coupled together as a tandem system, and also the project would include flood protection measures downstream of themselves. On the Sturgeon Creek, you'll notice there's a culvert replacement near the bottom of the slide. That's on Sugnet Road. This is a culvert that was identified as needing to be replaced in the city capital improvement plan. As we move north along the Sturgeon Creek, you'll notice a couple of stormwater storage options, stormwater detention basin options. One of them is located on the Jacobs Drain on the airport property in the southwest corner of the airport. And the other one is located on the west side of Sturgeon Road on a large city parcel that is not developed. And then lastly, on this slide, you can see some stormwater flood control structures. Those are located on some state land owned by the DNR at the top of the slide, just west of the Sturgeon Woods development. Next slide, please. As we slide over to our center panel, you can see Main Street a little bit better, as well as the Sturgeon Creek system. So on Main Street, there's 2 pump stations that are being evaluated, one on the Sturgeon Creek and one on the Snake Creek. So these are part of that flood prevention system that would help prevent the river water from pushing backwards up the Snake and Sturgeon Creek during a high river stage and flooding out the adjacent areas. As we move upstream on the Snake Creek through the golf course property, you'll notice that there is a orange highlight there, and that's at Sunset Park. So that would be an option of creating some contouring and layout within the park that would store water during high flow events, but continue to function as is during day-to-day flows. Just north of there, there's several culverts identified for potential replacement projects. One of them is on Saginaw Street on the Rockwell Drain. We have one on the Siebert Drain at Wheeler. And then we have one on the Siebert Drain at Sullivan. Additionally, you'll notice on the Lingle Drain North, which is the third tributary that contributes to the Snake Creek that you can see on the map. We have some orange highlighting on that. The Slingle Drain North through the Barstow Woods Park is currently a storm sewer, and there was a project suggested that included turning that county drain storm sewer into an open channel drainage system to create a creek through the park. And also there was an idea that if we're going to go through and create a creek in Sturgeon Woods, or excuse me, in Barstow Woods, maybe we look at contouring it to provide some additional flood storage as well. The final panel here on the next slide is the east panel. So you can see this panel has several of the storm sewer replacement projects. We have one on Bayless Street, which is the small little reach of storm sewer over on the left side of the screen. And then near that, we have a storm sewer replacement on Dartmouth. And then there are also storm sewer replacements on Scott, East Lawn, and Saginaw. And then finally, there are two more on the slide, one up kind of near the top of the slide that would be along Lawndale, Sweetbriar, and Waldo. And then one on the edge of the slide near Clay, Jay, and Payne Street. In addition to the storm sewer replacements in this part of town, there are also two more that are on the list, one on Plumtree and one on Avon and Smith Street that are kind of on the south edge of town. Next slide, please. So I just summarized those projects looking at the map. Here is kind of our table that we have been using to track them. We have the alternative ID assigned to all of these. So these are kind of our tracking numbers that help us keep track of them and help describe how they're combined with each other and how they interact with each other for several of these. We have the water course. So which water course the flooding is trying to be addressed on with this project. So all of the ones on the Sturgeon Creek are Sturgeon Creek related flooding that we're trying to resolve, for example. And then we have a summary of the alternative. So you'll notice that some of these are highlighted in an orange color. These are projects that were removed due to being not practical, identified as not being effective, or outside of the scope of the study. And then there are several of them that are highlighted in a pink color. Those are projects that were currently removed from the list due to anticipated permitting challenges and expenses based on Eagle feedback. So these are the projects that are for the study identified as, maybe not being the best project. So these still are potentials for future projects, but right now we're trying to hone in on projects that meet our objectives of this study in producing a short-term project that could be used to fill the need for that $40 million grant that is both 25 that needs to be spent by 2026, so 25 million by 2026 and 15 million by 2028. So we're really focusing in on projects that are good fits for those grants. And then we have one more slide. And this is the rest of the projects. So you can see that there's a couple that were eliminated here due to not being practical, effective, or outside of the scope of the study. But here we have a lot of storm sewers identified that were taken from that 2018 study, or storm sewers that were looked at due to public comment. And then we also have the different items off of the city's capital improvement plan, which were mainly culvert replacements and looking at turning that Barstow Woods storm sewer into a open channel drainage system like a creek. On the next slide here, I just wanted to reiterate the projects that were eliminated, we identified as not being practical, so they don't meet the goals of the objective. They don't appear to be feasible to implement at this time. There's several of them that we got through our engineering modeling, and we identified that these weren't as effective at flood reduction as we had hoped, and they weren't providing the impacts that were desirable. We looked at several of them and eliminated them because they weren't cost effective compared to other viable alternatives that provided the same type of function. Several of them were outside of the scope of our study, so we decided that these particular projects may fit better with that upcoming Army Corps study. So we're going to hand those off to them. And then there were several, as I mentioned earlier, that were identified as being very difficult and costly to obtain Eagle permits on. All the other projects are currently undergoing evaluations, and we will continue to identify them as a promising project or maybe a project that needs to be taken off the list for this particular purpose. Now, being eliminated from this project list does not mean that it's further consideration is not going to be given. Like I said, there's future phases of flood reduction efforts continuing. And one of the bases for developing our project list is looking at those past studies and what projects were identified that still might be good potential projects. So some of the items on our list may be referenced in future studies. Next slide, please. And with that, that concludes my presentation tonight here on our alternatives analysis project summary, and I'm going to hand it off to Bree for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Nick. So at this time, we will be taking any questions. If we run out of time, we will be sure to follow up with any questions at the end. To get us started, would any of these projects negatively or positively impact any future Corps of Engineer projects? Which one of our panelists would like to answer that one?
So I can take that one, Bree. The answer to that is no. We're working hand in glove with the Corps. They know what we're looking at, and they are cooperating, and we're doing this in a collaborative way, and they're not going to let us head down a dead end. So being very careful about that.
And Bree, this is Bill. Bree, let me just make a quick add-on to JW's comment. You know, the relationship that we've built with the Army Corps of Engineers and the city and Midland County, Midland, and the Midland Business Alliance really has been remarkable. We work hand in glove. They've come a couple of times to Midland. We visited them in Detroit a couple of times, and so we're building this relationship that is very positive, and it'll reap some big dividends in the future.
Great, thank you, Bill. That was a great addition. Next question. What is the design capacity basis used for determining whether the culverts were adequate or not? Nick, would you mind answering this one?
Yes, so when looking at the culverts that were identified as being replaced, we were looking at them primarily for a 25-year storm because most of them were located on a county drain, and that is the design standard that is typically implemented within Midland County for open channel drainage systems on county drains.
To follow up on that question, Nick, regarding the various detention basins shown on the map, would those be above ground areas to collect water or underground infrastructure to hold water?
Several of the ones on that overall map that I showed before we started to whittle the list down were, work within the existing floodplain to enhance its capabilities. So it would be just moving earth around to reshape the floodplain to make it more efficiently store water. So it would kind of be below grade, if you will. The other ones would be creating new detention ponds, again, below grade to store the stormwater. Our idea, typically in your stormwater storage, you're looking for the water to flow in and out of that via gravity. So below grade is the typical approach if at all possible.
Thank you, Nick. One more. What kind of retention capacity would the orange retention basins give for those areas? i.e., like how much volume could the sturgeon retentions north of US 10 hold versus the volume from 10-year, 25-year, 50-year flood, etc.?
So that takes a pretty detailed answer. I'd have to get into our modeling results, and we're still working on finalizing those models. As I mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing study, but the volumes would increase as the storm event increased, and so we would be holding a little bit more for a 25-year than a 10-year, but we're basically looking at identifying an area that we could be used for storage and then engineering a solution on the water control structure on the downstream side of that to back the water up to the appropriate levels to maximize the storage without causing any negative impacts to neighboring properties. But those numbers and the exact model results would be summarized in the report that we're going to be working on delivering this fall to aid the city council in making their decisions.
And will the public be able to see that? What's presented to city council, the report that you're writing, is that going to be available to the public?
That would be delivered to city council, and then Brad, I don't know if you want to discuss how the city might be disseminating that information.
Sure, Nick.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So council, as JW, I think it was mentioned, the reports, the outcome, essentially the products that could work need to be wrapped up towards the end of September, presented to city council in October. Council will have essentially the month of October to review the reports that are presented, the data, the information, the recommendations, all of which will be bound up and put together in at least a draft report at that stage of time. And then again, over the course of October, council will have to wrestle with all of those and come to a conclusion by the end of the month as to which projects they want to move forward with. And then that all has to be tied up in an agreement with Eagle by the end of the year. So there will be public opportunity for comment. Anything that council does will be in an open session of city council. Any members of the public are welcome to attend and make comment on those as we proceed with them throughout the month of October.
Thank you, Brad. Why do we think that the 25-year flood basis is the right basis to design for when we have had significantly higher floods, 100-year plus, in the past few decades? Who would like to answer this question?
I can answer that, Bree.
Thank you, Nick.
So that is the typical design storm. 10-year and 25-year design storms end up being the design storm that is written across most of the state of Michigan for design policies for stormwater conveyance systems. It ends up being a good balance of investment in the infrastructure to prevent flooding on most storms while not, bankrupting the community or struggling to make ends meet because of the large scale of the investment. So a 25-year storm means that it has a 4% chance at happening in any one given year. So we're looking at a piece of infrastructure that would have a 96% chance at succeeding in any given year. And there's always a bigger storm out there. So we could put a 100-year, 200-year storm system in. It would require extensive rework of many of the city roads, all the bridges, all the culverts, and it would be very costly and expensive and frankly unaffordable in most situations. And it would still have a chance at getting exceeded. So 25-year ends up being the typical standard, that or a 10-year storm ends up being the two typical standards that are used for municipal drainage systems throughout the state of Michigan for the most part.
Great, thank you. When were those design storm standard basis for Michigan first defined? Nick, I believe that question's direct to you.
Unfortunately, I don't have the dates available of when a lot of these were established. It's important in saying the design storm was established and selected. It's a statistical analysis. So while we picked a 10-year storm or a 25-year storm for the design standards in most of these communities, while that design storm has remained the same for many years, varied statistical analysis have taken place to identify what that 10-year storm is or what that 25-year storm is. So there's been multiple iterations of the rainfall intensity studies completed, and we're working on data that we're getting from the Army Corps of Engineers, which is based on rainfall analysis and probability that was recently completed in this area within the last several years. So we're working on the most up-to-date information available from the Army Corps of Engineers. And what's been identified as a 10-year storm or a 25-year storm today does not match up with what a past study may have suggested it is. So the rainfall intensities are changing to reflect current weather patterns.
Thank you, Nick. Next question. What is the time frame for these projects to be built or completed? Who would like to answer that question?
So Bree, this is Brad. I'll start on some of this because of the fact that the money that was acquired and appropriated to the City of Midland by the state of Michigan has timelines established to it and tied to it. We do have to comply with those timelines, and those are in two different pots, if you will. There is a $25 million allocation that is coming through Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, and their budget. Those are ARPA dollars, which were mentioned earlier, I believe, by Nick in his comments. They have to be committed by the end of this year, which is why, again, back to my earlier comments, council has to make decisions in October so that they can be secured via agreement with EGLE by the end of the calendar year. From that point forward, we have 2 years to actually physically complete and spend the money. So we are looking at the end of 2026 for at least $25 million worth of work coming out of the funds that we have appropriated. The second pot, if you will, of money is 15 million that comes through the MEDC's funds. Those have a little bit longer timeline, not terribly longer. I believe the timeline on that is the end of 28. But again, they have to be expended fully by that point in time. So it sounds like a long ways off. Quite frankly, when you're talking infrastructure of the type that we are referencing, that we may be looking at, it's a pretty compressed timetable. So, but those are the timelines. So this is not funds that we can sit on if we don't expend it, if we don't commit it, and do all the things that we're required to by the appropriation. We would actually lose these dollars. They would go back to the state.
Let me add to that. I think that all of us understands we have a measured sense of urgency, making sure that we utilize the investment, that the $40 million we've received from the state of Michigan in a wise fashion, to demonstrate this responsibility to our community, and then also to the legislature, that we made wise decisions in implementing this investment in Midland, which our mission is to minimize the frequency and severity of flooding. We're going to need additional funds, and so we want to make sure that we are responsible in expending them. And also, we know it's going to rain again, and so we don't want to just sit around, so to speak, and we're not holding on to the money. We want to make sure we spend it wisely. The 25 and 15, as Brad, I think, expressed so properly. They could be connected. They might be separate projects. They all kind of come into play to reduce the severity and frequency of flooding. But it's October is D-Day for the, so to speak, for the city council, where they'll be making their decisions, and it's an important time for the community.
Thank you, Bill. Next question. Can these smaller projects make a difference? JW, would you like to take that one?
I will. They will make a difference. So I know we talk about designing our storm sewers for the 25-year flood, but when Nick is looking at some of the large-scale detention, he's also looking at how it impacts larger floods, the 50, 75-year floods. And when we're looking at the levee and pump station solutions that won't be built probably under this tranche of funding because mainly of the permitting issues. They may well be built with Corps of Engineers, and those would be made both better by the detention and stormwater improvements that we're doing now, and actually a little bit less expensive because of the detention that we may, if we choose to do the large scale detention, that seems to be a focus of some of the questions. We'll actually make the eventual pump stations smaller because we'll be able to store water and reduce the amount they have to pump during a storm event. So yes, they will make a difference. I think this is a long-term project. I've often talked that this may take 30 years to get all the way home, but each project we do is going to build on, be buildable on the next project. We'll be able to build on it and make it better. So yes, these projects will make a difference.
Thank you, JW. So there seems to be a minor concern with the city having so many projects that don't meet the 10 to 25-year flood events. Can someone give a little bit more background on that?
Bree, I can weigh in on my historical experience conducting studies like this in many communities throughout the state. So, you know, a lot of our infrastructure was installed and established many years ago. A lot of our storm sewers have a design life of 50 to 100 years before the pipe goes bad or the infrastructure needs to be replaced due to condition. And so, as I mentioned previously, our understanding of what a 10-year storm actually is or a 25-year storm actually is changes as the statistics change, as the weather changes. So many times when the infrastructure was constructed, it did meet a 10-year or 25-year storm. It met the design standard. But as time went on and development occurred and the intensities, our understanding of the stormwater intensities has changed because of the weather changing. It kind of moves something from a situation where maybe it used to meet the 10-year storm, but maybe it doesn't today. And so that's why, you know, we go through and we study things and we look at what was previously done and if it still meets today's needs.
Thank you, Nick.
Bree, I'll just add to that. One of the other factors that can influence this is the conditions, particularly of the pipe system. The city has spent literally millions of dollars looking at the pipe systems. We sent cameras through the storm sewer systems to look specifically at the condition of our pipes to determine where we have infiltration, which is just groundwater getting into the pipes where it should not, for example. And as that happens, as those pipes deteriorate, as the leaking increases over years, whether it be by deterioration, damage to a pipe, whatever it might be, that can decrease the ability to absorb stormwater too. And so there's a variety of attack methods, if you will, that can be done. We are, for example, as I mentioned, lining pipes, spending a lot of money, not only looking at them, but actually trying to improve the condition of them as we go along. So that's one avenue of attack. And then certainly these other more obvious and apparent methods, such as on above ground detention, the different increasing capacity, whether it be culverts or actual pipe size, all of those are factors that can be looked at as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach that needs to be taken in order to address the entire problem.
Thank you, that's a great addition, Brad. Thank you. There's a comment out here that I want the panel to hear and have a chance to respond to if they feel like it. So there's an importance around how we are explaining how well the community can understand the 10-year and 25-year floods and how that relates to how it is going to make any material difference when the next 100-year flood comes. Do any of our panelists have something they would like to add to this statement?
So I'll start, but it's only going to be a partial answer. So, and Nick, maybe when I'm done, I'll toss it to you to explain a little bit about what the the scope and difference between a 25-year storm, for example, and a 100-year storm is. People often think of that in terms of magnitude and sort of an exponential scope, when it's not really the case. But that being said, Nick, I think, explained it best early that there has to come sort of a cost benefit analysis. We have to take a look at what can be done, what can reasonably be done, and looking at all of the aspects of a storm system. So the pipes, the culverts, the buildings, the bridges, all of those aspects of it. Improving certain areas of a system doesn't necessarily mean that the entire system is going to work better, because it could simply translate or transfer a problem from one area to another. So will improving, for example, to a 10 or a 25-year storm take care of a 100-year flood or a 1% chance flood? No, is the simple answer to that. But what we have to do is what we can do and can afford to do to the best of our abilities. And with that, I'll throw it to Nick to talk a little bit about scale and difference between those storm events.
Yeah, so thanks, Brad. So just to be clear, you know, the 10-year, 25-year, 50-year, 100-year, it's a probability, right? Just because you have a 10-year and you compare it to a 100-year doesn't mean that it's 10 times the size. It's just probability percentage of that occurring. One has a 10% probability of happening in any given year. One has a 1% probability of happening in any given year. So there's a difference in depth of rainfall that correlates to each one of those based on that probability. It doesn't scale. You can't take the numbers and divide them out and say one's 10 times the size of another. So there may not be that big of a difference between some of these different storm events compared to what you might be thinking in your mind when you try to scale them. It's important to note that as I mentioned during the presentation, we're looking at two different types of flooding. So there's the flooding caused by the river and then the local flooding. So improving the local drainage system by upsizing storm sewers, improving culverts, storing water, improving conveyance capacities. Even if you have a 25-year storm, and let's say a 50-year storm hits, and maybe there's a little bit of flooding, improved capacity is improved capacity. So it's going to help. Let's say the water does flood the road out. Well, instead of maybe being flooded for a week, it's flooded for a couple of hours. So improved capacity in the local system is still a benefit. Even if it does become overwhelmed by a statistically larger event, it's still going to move the flooding away quicker, and you might see it, but it's going to be in a much reduced capacity versus an existing system that might only meet like a 1-year storm or a 2-year storm or even a 5-year storm. So getting upsized infrastructure when we're talking about drainage is always a good thing and is going to contribute to the overall flood resiliency to the community, even with you know, maybe not being a 100-year storm all the time. It's still, you'll see the water go away quicker if you do happen to get a larger storm event because you have an increased capacity.
Great answer. Thank you, Nick. At this time, I would like to encourage folks to add any additional questions to the Q&A. I have one more question for the panel, and we will be keeping an eye on the Q&A if any more come in. What happens if the city council doesn't pick a project? Will it never be done? Brad, would you be able to answer that?
I kind of figured you might throw that one my way. So again, I alluded to a little bit of this earlier. So with the 40 million that's been appropriated and allocated specifically to the City of Midland, that has to be expended on flood protection measures or flood mitigation measures. And so council will have, at least we anticipate at the end of this process, it could be 1, it could be 10, it could be 20. We don't know the number of viable projects, and we won't know until this work of the Spicer Group is completed towards the end of September. But we anticipate certainly that there's going to be projects presented to them that are viable, that will be beneficial and meaningful to reducing and minimizing at least flood impacts across the city. Council will then have the choice to say, yes, we want to move forward with 1, 2, some combination of those. I would anticipate that if they are viable projects and reasonable projects, council is going to pick some of them. That said, the council does have the option of saying, no, we don't think any of these are the right things to do for our city. If that is the case, then frankly, I'd be on the phone very quickly to Eagle and say, okay, what options do we have? Because we don't have projects to allocate and specifically call out in an agreement. Can we continue to utilize these ARPA funds beyond the end of the year or not? There's a possibility that if council was to say, nope, absolutely no projects will move forward, that those ARPA funds would have to be returned to the state and then could be reallocated to some other community or in some other way. Again, I don't anticipate that. I know that city council, having worked with them closely over at least since 2017, which is really when we've really been studying this issue since, are very committed, very energized in the sense that they want to see a solution come about that's not been done before. And we're into the hard stuff now. Well, the easy thing, the low-hanging fruit's been taken. Now we're into the hard choices. But I don't see council backing away from having to make those tough choices to move forward. But again, I don't speak for council. It is their choice at the end of the day.
Thank you, Brad. At this time, I would like to turn it back to Tony to close us out for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bree. And my thanks to everybody that's joined us. Certainly to the panelists. You know, we've been so fortunate in this effort to really partner with the community, the city, the county, the Corps of Engineers, and just an amazing group of volunteers who have led this effort. So we've had a team that put this together to make sure it went smoothly, and thanks to them. So really appreciate it. We want to make sure that we continue to hear from the community, to share information, but also to hear from all of you and get your input, your insights, and your thought. And so we got several ways to do that. August 19th, as mentioned earlier, is community open house from 4 to 7 in city council chambers. Please join us, invite your friends and neighbors to join us. You know, it'll be an informal setting, but a chance to present information, to have discussions, to get your questions. Again, we want to make sure that we're having this process as open and transparent as possible, but also we've got a wonderfully talented community kind of getting everybody's feedback. So monthly reports at city council meetings. Next is August 26th. There are also past city council meetings recorded, June 10th, July 22nd. And we're going to have this recorded. As you've noted, this is recorded. So we'll be getting that out there. You know, there's a couple spots that really information's available. The City of Midland has a great website. So cityofmidlandmi.gov, flood resiliency, and then the mbami.org flood study. So please use either of those. Give us your thoughts, your questions, your feedback. And we just thank you for your engagement. Again, thank everybody that made this possible. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation going forward as we look for solutions to help our community continue to move forward. Thanks for being with us tonight.